tonight's talk reflects on our past and how our past continues to impact our present. And with that in mind, and as we kick off the season, I invite you to reflect on our own site, our history, and our community. And so to that end, and as a museum dedicated to presenting and celebrating art from around the world and from many cultures, I recognize that the Art Institute of Chicago is located in the traditional lands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. And many other tribes also called this area home, such as the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. It is also today that one of the largest urban American Indian communities continues to live in the United States. And I want us to keep all of that in mind as we engage with the museum now and in the future. To our speaker, I'm so thrilled and so grateful that James Meyer is with us tonight. James will be using ideas from his newly released book, The Art of Return, the Sixties and Contemporary Culture, which was published by University of Chicago Press, to foreground ideas of that in his talk. He will explore particularly a body of work by the artist Kerry James Marshall, who I'm so glad is with us tonight, and invite us to consider in case there was any doubt, Kerry, you have fans. And invite us to consider why it is that perhaps more than any other decade, the 60s continue to capture our collective imagination. Please note that there will not be a Q&A for the interest of time, but there will be a book signing immediately following the talk right at the top of our stairs. James Meyer is a curator of modern art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. He was previously the Winship Distinguished Research Associate Professor of Art History at Emory University and Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Dia Art Foundation. In addition to his new book, he is the author of Minimalism, Art and Polemics in the 1960s and has edited several books. He has curated one-person shows of the artists Anne Truitt, Mel Bachner, and Kerry James Marshall, and the exhibition Los Angeles to New York, Duane Gallery, 1959 to 1971 at the National Gallery of Art. With that, please join me in welcoming James Meyer.
Thank you, Jackie. And it's really a thrill to be here. Some of you know I've lived in Chicago and I love Chicago, and I always am hoping to come back to Chicago. And so it's very special to be here and to be at the Art Institute, one of the great cultural institutions in the country, and to speak with regard to my new book, The Art of Return, which was actually released yesterday and published by the University of Chicago Press, as you've heard, and they've done a beautiful job. And it seemed fitting to begin all this here in Chicago. And I want to thank Jackie Terraza for asking me to come, and also Allison Muscolino and Fawn Ring for organizing my trip. And I'm honored also to be able to speak in memory of Carol Winston. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the ideas of the book and how it came about, The Art of Return. Some of you know I've written quite a bit about the 60s and the 70s as a historian. Wrote books about minimalism. I curated the Duane exhibition from 59 to 71 in Los Angeles and New York. And I always found myself returning to that period, wanting to understand that period, to historicize that period. And the narratives I wrote were straightforward narratives. They tended to be chronological, art historical works. But the more I was writing these art historical accounts of that period, I started to ask why. Why was I going back to that period? And why were so many artists and writers and scholars and filmmakers going back to that time? What was it about that period that drew us back, that caused us to return? And I began to call this the return of the 60s, the return of a past in the present. And I began to think about practices that go back to that period, which I call the return to, the individual mnemonic act of attempting to go back to that time. And I discovered that many artists I was looking at, contemporary artists, were also returning to that period, and also that many writers and filmmakers and reenactors, that it was a much bigger phenomenon than merely an art phenomenon. And I started to notice that many of the artists and writers were born in this period of the long 60s, a period that might stretch from the mid-50s to the mid or late 70s. And I began to wonder why so many of us were going back, and I thought, well, a lot of us were born in that time. That we were perhaps what I might call 60s children or 70s children. We're going back, we're returning to the time that either precedes our childhood or that is the time of childhood, a time when we were absorbing so much that was happening in the world, but didn't understand it, couldn't assimilate it. This is, of course, true for every generation. The pop artists go back to the comic strips of their childhood. We're all drawn back to the time of childhood. But the 60s was, of course, a revolutionary period around the globe, the last revolutionary period. And revolutionary periods create a surfeit or excess of memory. There's so much that happens that we spent a lot of time trying to absorb what it was that happened and how it impacted us now. And so this required a different kind of narrative or different kind of writing than I had practiced before. It became increasingly a work of writing and a work that included my own voice and my own subjectivity embedded into the book. Because, of course, I'm one of these children, and I'm trying to understand my own being driven back to that period as well. So why does the 60s matter so much? Why does it keep returning? As I said, it's a revolutionary period. And what that means, it harbors within itself the dream of being new, the modernist dream that we can invent a whole new world from the ground up. A dream that goes back to the previous revolutionary periods, all the way back to the French Revolution. The 60s is the memory of revolution and the memory of modernism and of modernity. It's the last time when this dream of being new was still alive, was still vital. We don't harbor that dream anymore. And so the 60s, I argue, is our modernism. What modernism was for the 60s, now the 60s and 70s is our modernism. So it's also the beginning of the time that we're in. It looks back and it looks forward. It's the time of revolutionary new politics, identity politics, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, the modern environmentalist movement, the American Indian movement are all generated in this period. And status, progressive politics, the Great Society, and the invention of all sorts of new social policies, including the Immigration Act of 1965, which is currently under assault. But the 60s is not all radical and innovative and transformative. It's also, of course, been said to be the beginning of global capitalism for our time, of consumer culture, the mass media age, the television age, and even the beginning of the digital age. The mainframe computer and digital technologies are entering into the world. It's also, of course, a period when reaction is emerging. Reactive movements, Nixon's silent majority, reactions to the innovations of the 60s that keep recurring and keep returning to the 60s and attacking the 60s. Whether the Tea Party movement or the current Trumpist anti-immigration movement, in various ways are attempts to repeal innovations and changes of that period. The 60s is a recent past, by the way. It's not the Middle Ages. It's not the 19th century. It's a past that we remember. Many of us were alive then in different ways. We were either children or teenagers or grown-ups, or we're the children of 60s children, and we've heard a lot about it through media, through accounts of what happened. So it's a recent past as far as pasts go. It occupies an unstable mnemonic ground. It's both history, it's memory, and it's also a time of nostalgia. It produces longing for those of us who feel we missed what happened. It's a period that can be described as good and bad, depending on your political point of view. And I will speak later on about the good and the bad 60s. On one hand, utopia, Camelot, the dream of being new, Woodstock. On the other hand, Dallas, Memphis, Altamont, Kent State, Manson murders. The good and the bad. There are different ways of mapping that period. The decade, the decadal 60s, 60 to 69. The long 60s, perhaps the murder of Emmett Till and Brown versus the Board of Education to the retreat from Saigon in 75. Or the year 68, the year that brings the period to a kind of culmination, right outside the Art Institute on Michigan Avenue. And in Paris and elsewhere around the world, everything is coming to a head in 68, and it becomes a synecdoche for the whole. As I said, the book has myself in it, and it begins when I'm a child and I encounter hippies hitchhiking in 1971, and it ends when I'm a middle-aged person and I'm attending the March on Washington 50th anniversary in DC. And that is the occasion of the talk I'm now going to give. And Kerry James Marshall's extraordinary art is the pretext of this meditation on the end of the 60s. When will the 60s end? How do we relate to that time? And how, in particular, do we look back at the civil rights movement and its legacy now? And I shall say, moreover, it was inspired by the Renaissance Society show that was held in 1998 of Kerry James's work, organized, of course, by Suzanne Guez. August 2013, it was a sultry day 50 years ago when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in this place. In the photos of the original march, the reflecting pool is a blank spot in the middle of the surging crowd, bordered by giant elms heavy with leaves. King smiles and waves at the thousands of marchers gathered at the solemn temple at the edge of the Potomac. 50 years later, the same weather. The air thick with humidity, a constant sun. The marchers sit on blankets and folding chairs or stand on the unforgiving pavement. We mill about in crabgrass and patches of dirt and crane our necks to catch a glimpse of the podium. We look at one another with curiosity as we listen to the speakers and consider our presence in this place. The organizers of the original march were highly conscious of the twined symbolism of place and time. They held the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom during the centennial year of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, held it on the steps of the memorial on whose walls that document is chiseled word for word. Inside, the great marble statue of the slain president looks down the pool of water at the Washington Monument at the top of the opposite hill. The entire sweep of American history, the nation's unification, fracture, and reunification, its past and its future, is embodied in that effigy's impassive gaze. King was the last of the speakers that day. A century after Lincoln signed his decree, quote, that great beacon of hope, millions of people were not truly free. King lamented. Black people were barred from whites-only schools and drinking fountains and obstructed from voting. Too many Americans lived on an island of poverty in an ocean of material prosperity. The protesters had gathered to address these galling injustices, and they marched in support of a moral principle. And this is Dr. King. We've come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. One of King's most enduring phrases, "The fierce urgency of now is a state of presentness impelled by belief." It suggests being in one's moment and taking hold of it, not allowing time to pass us by. Fierce urgency is revolutionary time, the temporality the philosopher Hannah Arendt calls impatient, the time I describe in my book as the time of being new. The year 1963 was, quote, "not an end, but a beginning," King said. And then the great orator departed from his written marks and broke into an ecstatic call for freedom. The Georgia preacher's voice soared as he described a time when freedom would ring across the nation, a time when young people of all backgrounds and beliefs would join together and, quote, "hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope." King's "I Have a Dream" speech is the consummate expression of what I call the good 60s. Confronting an unacceptable reality, he envisions a utopic future, a perfect union. He imagines an American citizenry bound together by democratic values and mutual respect. King and his fellow activists did have some cause for hope then. The previous May, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, ordered his men to loose dogs and water hoses on black children, turning public sympathy in support of the movement. Disgusted by a photo on the front page of the New York Times showing a German shepherd mauling a young protester, President Kennedy instigated a report that served as the basis of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The situation was volatile nonetheless. 3 weeks after the protesters went home, a cabal of Klansmen bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church, burying 4 young girls in the rubble. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November. And with the assassinations in '68 of King and presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, an architect of the Civil Rights Act, the dream shattered. The Gandhian techniques of nonviolence that had proven so effective during the movement's finest hours no longer seemed to work. King's murder triggered the social entropy he preached against, and this is King. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. The good 60s descended into a bad 60s. Riots broke out in Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City, and many other cities, causing dozens of African Americans to lose their lives. In Washington, people took to the streets. They looted stores and smashed windows. Entire blocks burned on 14th Street. Clouds of smoke darkened the sky above the Capitol. There are many 60s endings. The conclusion of the decadal 60s, the 60s that begins in 1960 and ends in '69, is one ending. So are the various conclusions of the long 60s, the 60s that spans the mid-50s to well into the 70s. The idea of the end of the 60s is a dividing line, a temporal marker. It suggests the waning of a temporality of imminence, King's fierce urgency, and a revolutionary ontology, the 60s principle of perpetual newness, of being new. And it suggests the final and the irrevocable decline of futurist modernism, the dream of newness of the avant-garde and earlier modernisms that the 60s remembered and still believed in. The end of the long 60s is a consolidation of the neoliberal order, of unyielding corporate and oligarchical control, and on the left, a feeling of powerlessness, of more of the same, a situation critics compared to the period of post-1789 retrenchment known as the Restoration, a time when, quote, a previous language and set of propositions for emancipation had, quote, run into the sand. Like the art historian T.J. Clark, the author of this description, The philosopher Alain Badiou has spoken of an uncanny resemblance between our moment and the post-revolutionary period in France, as if we find ourselves in a time not of 60s return, but of something very different. The reprise of those reactionary moments of history that cause past progressive eras to seem impossibly monumental and distant to those who dare to imagine something better. In the historical scheme of Alain Badiou, there are periods of history when the emancipatory idea is dominant, and intervallic periods when the Enlightenment values of universal freedom, democracy, and equality have gone into hibernation. The red years, as Badiou refers to the 60s, was the last historical time of recent memory. Yet intervallic eras matter too, the philosopher insists. They revealed, quote, the possibility of a new situation without for now being in the position to realize that possibility. Badiou, theorist of the event and witness to the events of May 1968 in Paris, locates the 60s at the end of a historical cycle reaching back to the French Revolution, the original event. If history is the full reprise of the emancipatory idea in Badiou's scheme, then what I'm calling the 60s return is the reemergence of that imaginative possibility during a reactionary time. History is hermeneutical, we know from Nietzsche. The central concern of his text on the uses and abuses of history for life is how the past operates on us, on the living. Quote, we must know the right time to forget as well as the right time to remember. We need history and we need to feel unhistorically, Nietzsche says. Let us remember and remember to forget. There is a time for remembering and a time for forgetting. After the long 60s ended, sometime perhaps in the 70s, another 60s, I argue in my book, returned as nostalgia. This has not been unproblematic. The memory of the 60s is the memory of King's idea that we can be in our moment and change our situation for the better. His famous citation of the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker's metaphorical remark, quote, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, implies that we can intervene in history. We can bend the art of justice ever so slightly. King incites us to moral action. But if his words are to mean anything to us now, we must not allow ourselves to be weighed down by longing for a time when fierce urgency could be imagined and articulated. There's no going back to 1963. If life is impossible without forgetting, as Nietzsche insists, surely the final lesson of the 60s return is the need to let go of 60s memory after we've returned. These, at least, are some of the questions explored in Mementos, an ensemble of artworks first exhibited by Kerry Marshall at the Renaissance Society in 1998. The centerpiece of that installation was an arrangement of 4 oversized canvases hung on the wall. The souvenirs. A single motif recurs in these works. An angel welcomes us into her living room. Neither white, nor lithe, nor youthful as the angels of Western representation are usually depicted. Marshall's seraphs are middle-aged and elderly black women in contemporary dress. They look like women we know or have known. They just happen to have 2 enormous wings affixed to their shoulders. This admixture of the real and the unreal, the material and the ethereal, is the true conceit of the souvenirs. The paintings straddle 2 realities, a realm of middle-class domesticity, tangible and contemporary, and a transcendental domain of memory, a before. Like the angel herself, the living room of souvenir number 1 is deceptively ordinary, with pale green walls and wall-to-wall carpeting, a white curio cabinet lined with figurines and a prize goblet, and a gold leaf sconce draped with plastic grapes. A white sofa wrapped in plastic wards off sitters. The curtains are drawn. No daylight penetrates this airless space. We've arrived at the green parlor at the very moment the angel, who carries a vase of daffodils and roses, approaches a large table with claw-shaped feet. She gestures toward a crystal bowl of carnations, tulips, and greenery with one of her wings as she places the vase on the marble table. A black banner floats in a cloud, edged in rays of silver and gold. Depicting the well-known faces of King and the Kennedys, the banner recalls those mass-produced wall hangings that were often seen in African-American households during the late 60s and 70s, along with plates, ashtrays, and even pens stamped with the images of these individuals. The phrase, "We mourn our loss," written in the Gothic script of the Black Church, appears beneath their portraits and dates of birth and death. Above it all, the angel and the banner, above the curio cabinet and the strange sepulchral table, are the faces of many more angels framed by white wings. Circles of gold are suspended in the dewy atmosphere around these cherubim, who float several feet above our heads. And where the portraits of King and the Kennedys are hand-painted in the crude style of the historical banners, the faces of these angels are silkscreens of press photos, a medium developed by Andy Warhol during the early 60s, when many of these individuals lost their lives and articles about their deaths featured their portraits. Ghost-like traces of the dead, these angel faces appear from left to right in the order of their deaths. The NAACP field organizer, Medgar Evers, shot dead on the driveway outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi in '63. Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, the young victims of the church bombing. Voting volunteers, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, murdered by Klan members in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. Malcolm X, and the Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, massacred during a raid of Hampton's apartment by the Chicago police in 1969. Below this intricate arrangement, garlands and rosettes encrusted in gold, glitter, bracket the inscription "In memory of," written in the saccharine cursive font of a sympathy card. Souvenir 1 is knowingly illusionistic. Of all the souvenirs, the space is deepest here. The walls and ceiling and dining room entrance recede at acute and oblique angles behind a proscenium of gold fringe and braid. Prompted by these orthogonals, vision alights on the folds of curtain between the back of the angel's head and the tip of her wing, resting on her penetrating eyes. The carpet with garland borders recedes sharply, causing the marble table and the angel to tilt toward us despite their palpable weight. But Marshall also reminds us of the canvas's physical presence, its flatness, the fact that it's a sailcloth held up by grommets and screws, and the scene before us rests on a great collage of sheets of paper which, arranged in a grid pattern, interrupt the illusionism that he has so carefully established. He wants us to grasp that the otherworldly world of Souvenir 1 cohabits the actual space in which we stand. Marshall creates volume in order to compress it. The parlor of Souvenir 1 is a stifling place. He draws us into this boxed-in room, inducing sensations of enclosure and containment. He sets up the sort of fiction that Flemish devotional images do, that we have entered a domestic space that is both ordinary and extraordinary, a place where the divine has made itself known, and even the most incidental objects, a washing vessel, a vase of flowers, even a mousetrap, are suffused with a peculiar and veiled significance. Just as the interior of Robert Campin's Annunciation scene, the Marode altar, is both a cozy bedchamber and a setting of divine events, and just as the Virgin could be mistaken for a burgher's daughter of Bruges, so too Marshall's angels resemble actual women, I noted. Like the stage reality of Flemish holy scenes, the empathic realness of the souvenirs is a rhetorical effect. Where the masters of Netherlandish art bring us inside domestic interiors to witness the miraculous, Marshall positions us ambiguously in the temporal no man's land I describe in my book as the recent past, or recentness, the unstable mnemonic ground between a monumental past that forces itself into our awareness and a present in which we struggle to make meaning, to carry on. The angel's eyes fasten on ours. Have we interrupted her in the middle of her devotions? Or has she anticipated our arrival? What is the purpose of her behest, her invitation? The woman in black is an angel of memory who, quote, asks us to remember all the people who are represented there. Souvenir, from the Latin subvenire, means to call to mind, to remember. A souvenir is a token of memory, a memento, a reminder of what is past or gone. All of the works in Marshall's show were mementos. In souvenir number 2, gold glitter fringe and tassels frame another sacred living room. The bowl of carnations and tulips sits on a glass-top coffee table. A vase of white roses rests on a stand decorated with gold garlands. And though this angel holds a yellow vase identical to the one carried by her counterpart in Souvenir 1, the space of this work is shallower and wider. The codes of mourning have loosened somewhat. This angel wears a mourning shirt, yet her skirt is flowery and blue, as are her shoes. Marshall has painted the walls and furniture in warm tones of beige, orange, and rust. A comfortable wing-back chair and plush sofa welcome a sitter. A rack of ebony and jet magazines, another familiar sight in black homes of a certain vintage, suggests an ambience of reading and relaxation. Yet the curtains are drawn here too, and there's another mourning banner depicting King flanked by the Kennedys. The angel martyrs of the first painting float in a cloud beneath the ceiling. Here, 2 more join them. They are Viola Liuzzo and Jimmy Lee Jackson, whose murders in Alabama in 1965, along with the fatal beating of Unitarian minister James Reeb, catalyzed the passage of the Voting Rights Act that summer. We're asked to remember these angels too. The other souvenirs are painted black, white, and gray, in keeping with the somber tonality of mid-20th century newspaper and television imagery. The angel in Souvenir 3 wears a black slacks and a white blouse and carries a bouquet. The arrangement of flowers familiar to the beholder of the prior pictures rests on an antique table with slipper feet. A Victorian setting draped with a doily, old armchairs, an oval painting of classical temples, and a cabinet filled with goblets establish an atmosphere of refinement and repose. The mourning banner is less conspicuous, a partial reflection in the mirrored tiles above the mantel. Hanging on an imaginary wall, behind a viewer. The lamentation, "We mourn our loss," fragmentary, spelled backward, is barely legible. Civil rights memory recedes as other histories come into visibility. There are no faces here, only the names of prominent artists, writers, and performers, and the dates of their deaths during the decadal 60s, inscribed in silver glitter, each occupying a cloud of its own. The painter Bob Thompson, the novelist Zora Neale Hurston, the philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois, the playwright Lorraine Hansberry, the film star Dorothy Dandridge, and the sculptors Augustus Savage, Meta Warwick Filler, and Marion Perkins, and others are recalled. Names without faces, names with dates like tombstones, everything grisaille. The arc of memory is longer here. We've moved from a period, quote, we mourn, to a farther past, from the 60s to a time the 60s remembered. The return to one time brings us to one more distant. The 60s of Souvenir 3 is a way station to another past, to the 20s and 30s, when Hurston, Savage, and Perkins were at the height of their reputations, or to the turn of the last century, when Fuller exhibited at the Paris Salon, and Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk and co-founded the NAACP. The figures named in Souvenir 3 are trailblazers, their accomplishments all the more remarkable for having occurred during the nadir of Jim Crow segregation, intimidation, and violence. Yet they are not martyrs. The abstract paintings and tribal sculptures in the fourth canvas, Souvenir 4, evoke a modernist aesthetic vocabulary indebted to African and African diasporic prototypes. The names and faces of 23 jazz, blues, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll musicians, all of whom died between 1959 and 1970, crowd this space. The most celebrated figures recall others. Billie Holiday calls out the name of blues singer J.D. Short. Nat King Cole sings the name of folk performer Vera Hall. Dinah Washington, quote, remembers the blues guitarist J.B. Lenoir, who died 4 years after she did. An oversized scroll inscribed with even more names unfurls above a table stacked with knickknacks and books. The phrase, we mourn our loss, has migrated to the floor, transforming Souvenir 4 itself into a scene of mourning, from a scene of mourning into a kind of mourning banner, an enormous sympathy card, a collective declaration of sorrow. The angel in this image has collapsed into her settee. Her arms are folded in her lap. She doesn't even bother to greet us. Pressed behind the elaborate scroll of names, her argent wings almost disappear. We approach a structure at the back of the exhibition and peer through peepholes cut into the faux marble walls. Here is another funeral parlor. The deceased is a Pickaninny doll with racist features, his coffin decorated with masses of artificial blossoms. We're reminded of the flower-strewn bier of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old Chicago boy who was tortured and lynched in Money, Mississippi in 1955 after allegedly whistling at a white woman. Till's funeral in Chicago, where his disfigured corpse was displayed in an open coffin at his mother's insistence, jump-started the movement. Above the coffin is a projected film. In one sequence, children stand in the crossfire of gangs as pennies depicting the Illinois boy born Lincoln and his memorial spin in the darkness. Another scenario represents a funeral where the mourners worship an ethereal white Christ illuminated by a golden lamp. Speech bubbles erupt from the parishioners' mouths. Jesus, they cry, Jesus, Jesus. We do not ordinarily think of the Birmingham girls and the all too frequent victims of drive-by shootings or police killings in tandem. We think of the former as the intended targets of vicious Klansmen, quote, martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity, who died nobly, as King described them. Others, such as the teenager Hadia Pendleton, who died in a gang exchange in Chicago in 2013, 2 weeks after participating in President Obama's second inauguration with her high school band, are seen as the unlucky casualties of gang violence. The deaths of these lost, quote-unquote, girls and boys appear random and inexplicable, disconnected from the high ambitions of the civil rights era. In fact, all of these killings are connected. Marshall, author of an affecting series of portraits of such children, implies, no death is nobler or more meaningful than any other. Children have died, are dying. They die in all kinds of ways. A gang shooting, a, quote, frightened police officer pulling a trigger. The end is the same. The long history of racial inequity and conflict in the United States has counted too many young victims. A half-century on, the economic divisions between whites and blacks that King spoke about persist. Urban ghettos, de facto zones of segregation, remain. Weak gun control laws facilitate these losses. If Marshall's great canvases invite us to remember, his ersatz mausoleum, laid to rest, locates viewers very much in the present, when the constant, needless killing of African Americans, many of them very young, maintains Black life in a state of perpetual mourning, as the poet Claudia Rankine has described. A stark reality intrudes into the reverent memory space of the souvenirs. Remember, Marshall's angels instruct. Cicerones of memory, these winged women ask us to recall a monumental past. This injunction was the first mode of address of the Renaissance Society show, its explicit subject matter. But now Marshall embedded a reflexive or connotative dimension in these canvases. The angels ask us to join their mourning, to remember. As we gaze at the martyrs' faces, we consider this important demand. To whom are the souvenirs addressed? What are we supposed to remember? What purpose will memory serve? What are its costs? If we remembered all these names and all these dates, what good would it do? What does memory become? When does memory become the chain that Nietzsche warns us about? A burden so cumbersome, it impedes our ability to live entirely and productively in our own time. Marshall transforms middle-class homes into memorials. The Black living room is a funeral parlor haunted by spectral visions. Memory in the souvenirs is accretive, additive, nominative. With each new painting, we're asked to identify more faces and more names. 14 martyrs crowd into the parlor in Souvenir 1. In Souvenir 2, Marshall adds 2 more. Souvenirs 3 and 4 retrieve still other names and histories. Musicians cry out the names of other musicians. The dead recall the dead. Something happens when we reach Souvenir 4. The process of inscription and remembrance breaks down. The memory scroll is incomplete. The final names have become illegible. The letters J, I spell only the beginning of Jimi Hendrix's name. The angel does not rise to greet us as her counterparts do. She's put down those daffodils and those roses. She appears worn out, ground down. Her hands are clasped in resignation. Has the angel of memory grown weary of her charge? A photograph titled Mementos depicts a thrift shop picture frame nailed to a wall. The gold and silver frame at the center of this image is stuffed with old photographs of King and the Kennedys, of Malcolm, of Cheney and Schwerner, of Hampton and Clark, the Birmingham children, of Coleman Hawkins playing the sax, and Zora Hurston in a fashionable hat. Movement buttons and decals, a casket smothered in flowers, and a color image of a city in flames, the deadly Detroit riots of July 1967. Mementos is the brain of this eponymous exhibition, a meditation on Marshall's project and the archival source of its arresting imagery. At the top of this image, an incandescent lamp casts a warm light. Bathed in the fixture's lambency, the photo archive has been transfigured into a shrine of 60s recollection. Marshall has propped a mirror on the wall next to the picture altar. The border of the looking glass is etched in a floral pattern reminiscent of greeting card garlands. In this photo of other photos, the reflexive mode of address of his project has become explicit. Within the mirror's reflection, we make out an arm, an elbow, a wrist, a sliver of shirt. Marshall pictures himself picturing the 60s, a period entirely mediated by its extensive photographic and televisual representation. He is a partial presence at best. His body is fragmentary, his face obscured by the photos stuffed in the gaudy frame. The pictures of movement, martyrs, and events are more present in this image than the artist who gathers them, who remembers. For Marshall does remember. Born in Birmingham in 1955, he was 7 when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, and his family moved to Los Angeles as part of a larger migration of Black people to Southern California, the, quote, land of more of everything. In his painting, Watts, 1963, a work from his housing series, the artist represents himself and his sister and brother newly arrived in that neighborhood. The bright green grass sprinkled with daisies and the sun rising behind the garden apartments evoke a mood of hopeful expectation, while the abstract white splotches and circles of dripping paint disrupt the halcyon image. The introspective feeling evoked by these material intrusions within the world of the painting's sunny illusionism culminates in Marshall's affecting portrayal of his brother, who coils into a fetal position on the lawn, impervious to his surroundings. This is what Marshall remembers. He remembers the fiery speeches of the Black Panthers, who maintained their headquarters down the street from his family's second home in South Central. He remembers his, quote, Negro history teacher, Mr. Kawano, a member of the Panthers who came to class in army boots and military fatigues. He remembers the protests and strikes that occurred almost daily at his junior high school then. He remembers, most vividly of all, the summer night in 1965, when he and his brother watched the sky above Watts explode in fire. And this is Kerry James. Quote, I remember looking out of the second-floor window that night at a wall of flames on Central Avenue. Against that backdrop, the logo of this fast food chain called Jack in the Box, a grinning clown appearing from a box, was rotating slowly atop a pole. That image is forever seared into my memory. I distinctly remember telling myself, one day I'm going to make a picture of that. Marshall has described the souvenirs as history paintings. Grand in scale and rhetorically complex, they speak of his stated ambition to revive a highly valorized idiom of Western art that typically excluded Black figures and Black subject matter. The academic conventions of that genre, codified in the 18th century French and British academies, centered on the depiction of historical and mythological events rich in moral instruction. And so the artist of classical representation condensed complex stories into, quote, pregnant moments that a viewer could absorb and comprehend. Perhaps because he remembers the 60s so acutely, Marshall has typically avoided depicting that era's history directly. He never did manage to paint the fast food clown above a burning Watts. Or he depicts faraway historical events he never witnessed and historical figures whose lives precede his own. Recent or remote, the Black past is ever present in his depictions. Or it never left. History returns unbidden, unconsciously, in the minds of the living. It bubbles up through the earth and from the depths of the sea. It clings to the rooms and buildings he paints and etches the faces and bodies of his figures. And so different periods often cohabit in the same image. In Souvenir 2, the buzz cuts and Mad Med suits of King and the Kennedys and the period hairstyles of Viola Liuzzo and the Birmingham Girls locate these figures in the early 60s, while the touch-tone telephone and stack of Ameritech phone books date the scene to the period between that company's founding in 1984 and its renaming as AT&T in the 2000s. After the cell phone and the internet made the earlier technologies obsolete. Combining signifiers of distinct, if proximate eras, Souvenir 2 depicts a present that already appears dated and increasingly remote 20 years after Marshall completed it. Who are we precisely? The French historian Pierre Norat's distinction between lieu and milieu de mémoire is useful here. Though lieu de mémoire, the site of official memory, memory sequestered in a memorial, is memory as obligation, or duty memory, as Norat calls it. The milieu de mémoire is living memory, memory that flourishes in particular communities, such as the oral traditions handed down in the rural villages in France. The conservative Norat is nostalgic for these pre-industrial memory milieu. With urbanization, communities fracture, he claims. Living memory fades. As memory becomes archival, it becomes less personal and authentic. Duty memory trumps the, quote, authentic memory of the milieu. Kerry Marshall's works explore this distinction, I think. They evoke longing for a time imagined to be more momentous than ours, and then they defeat that desire. They enjoin us to remember, and they reflect on the costs of duty memory, of always gazing backward to an imagined golden age, next to which the present is felt to be lacking. The weight of civil rights memory for African Americans is particularly intense. The long 60s is the monumental era of recent Black history, a mnemonic burden to those who are constantly reminded of it. Duty memory transforms daily life into a state of unending recollection. In oppressed communities in particular, quote, the psychologization of memory has thus given to every individual the sense that his or her salvation ultimately depends on the repayment of an impossible debt. That's Pierre Norat. Duty memory is the mnemonic obligation of communities that carry traumatic recollections, a remembrance that is intertwined with feelings of loss. Consider the angel in Souvenir 1. Her skin is coal black, like the skin of the vast majority of figures in Marshall's Black figure art. A skin so unrelentingly black, it evokes not so much a natural skin tone as blackness as a sign within the discursive system we call, quote, race. Not only are her skin and her hair black, she wears black blouse, black slacks, and shoes. She's all black from head to toe. Only the whites of her eyes interrupt this dominant tonality. Skin and dress intermingle, are one and the same. Together, they form a sheath, a membrane covering her body. The angel of Black history is thus presented as one who mourns, whose memory of past sorrows has literally seeped into her skin and burrowed deep into her identity. She mourns a Black past that is both tragic and monumental. the movement martyrs and the absence of their kind now. She mourns the loss of, quote, a vocal, powerful, long departed Black self, as Richard Powell has written. So now I'm coming to the end of the 60s. The Reclaim the Dream March, as this afternoon's event is called, is billed as a continuation march, not a commemoration march. It's not enough to remember, the organizers insist. Let us continue the struggle, pick up where the movement left off. Posters and buttons with paired portraits of King and Obama exhort the crowd to, quote, reclaim the promise. What does this mean? Like the art of 60s reenactment, which I discuss elsewhere in my book, commemoration is a theatrical staging of memory. Though they are very different, today there is no re-speaking of 60s speeches, only speech. The Reclaim the Dream March fosters the dissonant cognition that reenactment does, an uncanny awareness of two eras at once. As we listen to such movement veterans as Murray Evers Williams, or Representative John Lewis, or the Reverend Joseph Lowry, the civil rights era does not feel so far away. The crowd grows silent as Evers Williams describes the horrible night her husband, Medgar, was gunned down in the driveway outside their home. Lewis recalls the beatings that he and others endured at the hands of the Alabama police at the bridge at Selma. Their recollections are searing. Their presence induces a feeling of awe, admiration for these individuals and for the history they made. The past that touches down at this gathering and touches every one of us as we listen to their words, to their trembling voices. No, the 60s does not feel ancient then, not when we listen to them, not when Evers Williams speaks Medgar's name. But as the day wears on and others take the podium, the heady memories of that time evaporate in the afternoon sun. Phrases like reclaim the promise ring hollow. In the famous photos of the first march, the reflecting pool is an image of serenity and hope. Today, the actual pool is a stagnant brown soup. I walk away from the water's edge to avoid the stench. The attempt to recharge memory is no simple matter. Fierce urgency is not easily retrieved. For there's an undercurrent in these speeches, these proceedings, a sense not of progress, but of déjà vu, the queasy suspicion that things are moving backward. Return today not only suggests the recovery of a past possibility, or what the critic Walter Benjamin calls the time of the now. It also suggests a containment of 60s energies, the retrenchment that began when the long 60s ended, and that causes that era to appear meaningful as it retreats. The movement's victories are being repealed, the speakers remind us. The Supreme Court has just gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the law that the Selma marchers fought for, that Liuzzo, Jackson, and Reeb died for. State legislatures are passing voter ID laws that make it harder for persons of color and the poor to vote. Harsh criminal sentences fall to an inordinate degree on Black men. African Americans are targets of racial murders, police profiling, and police abuse. Quote, in the 50s there was Emmett Till. Today there is Trayvon Martin. The Reverend Sharpton acknowledges the presence of the families of both victims, the northern Black boy lynched in Mississippi 58 years ago, and the teenager in a hoodie gunned down after leaving a Florida convenience store. His analogy has only grown more pointed since the Reclaim the Dream March. As images of riots in Ferguson and Baltimore dredge up memories of Detroit and Watts, and videos of unprovoked shootings of African Americans circulate on the internet, and names like Michael Brown, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Laquan McDonald, and Tamir Rice have become central references in the Black Lives Matter movement. As 9 parishioners are gunned down in yet another historical Black church, and as a revived white supremacist movement espouses hatred openly, egged on by an unscrupulous president who openly targets racial, religious, and sexual minorities for political power. The nonagarian Reverend Lowry says it best, quote, "Everything has changed, and nothing has changed." In 2003, Marshall returned to the theme of the Chicago exhibit. He completed one final painting in the souvenirs sequence. He named this work Memento 5. The last of the souvenirs is Grisaille. Here is another angel. She's dressed in white now and faces us head-on. The deep proscenium space of the first souvenir has been shallowed out. Where in the previous works, gold and silver glitter borders foster the illusion that we're in front of or inside these interiors. In Memento 5, the silver slats of a Venetian curtain divide the space the angel inhabits from the extremely shallow space in front, the fictive place where we stand. Marshall positions us behind these stripes of stacked lozenges. The angel grasps the curtains, draws them together. Her hands are in our space. Brilliant and opaque, the glitter blinds attract and repel perception. We peer into a space we've been barred from entering. The chamber of 60s memory is beyond our reach. What do we see? 3 bowls of flowers, a lamp, a coffee table, matching side tables, a sofa and love seat upholstered in chintz. A painting of trees frames the angel's face, emphasizing the whites of her eyes and the intensity of her stare. And where earlier works in the series are cluttered with names and faces, with bric-a-brac and furniture, the composition of Memento 5 is austere. The mourning banner has vanished. Just a few martyrs remain. Angels bearing the faces of King and the Kennedys float in the milky atmosphere. A wingless Malcolm hovers opposite. Marshall evokes the great division in 60s politics between Malcolm's militant Black nationalism and King's interracial, non-denominational fellowship, a tension that deepened after the assassinations of these men. Between the silver glitter slats of the curtain, we read the cardinal numbers of the decadal 60s, rotated 90 degrees. Why did Marshall take up this subject matter 5 years after the Chicago exhibit? The making of Memento 5 was inspired by the convictions of church-bombing conspirators Tommy Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry in 2002. After decades of stalling and subterfuge by the local authorities and the FBI, and with the death of Evers's assassin, Byron Della Beckwith, in a Jackson hospital in 2001, and the recent passing of Edgar Ray Killen, who directed the murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner at Parchman Farm Prison in Mississippi, still other protagonists of the most infamous events of civil rights memory were laid to rest. Memento 5 is an image of closure, shutting down, a painting of the end that is still ending, a 60s that is slipping away. What a time, the legend at the bottom reads, a doubled, emphatic expression of 60s longing. Remember, another text states simply, Painted in the same vintage font, this exhortation disappears behind the martyr's cloud, behind the portraits of King and the Kennedys, who in life dreamed of new frontiers and beloved communities, and who in death came to stand for a time that changed everything, that haunts us still. Let us count the years one more time. 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969. Then it is over. There are no more numbers. The angel retreats. The curtains are drawn. The room fades to darkness. The memory chamber is shuttered. We're no longer asked to remember. That's it.